Hi, I'm Gareth, and in this video we're going to have a little think about this musical matter, the false relation. Now, if you've never come across one of these before, it's tempting to think it might be some family relative who you don't quite get on with or something, but let me be assuring you, nothing to do with that at all. What is a false relation? Well, in music, it's when we have some kind of contradiction that is associated with one note. So let me give you an example of a false relation and then you'll see what I'm talking about. Say I had this chord, okay? And you can immediately see that in that chord, I've got F natural in the soprano part and F sharp in the tenor part. So you're probably immediately thinking, well, that's not going to work very well. Well, let's have a listen to it. Okay, well, it could be a cool chord in certain circles actually, and certainly in jazz, sometimes the false relation becomes a little bit of a feature of some of the chord work. But you can hear there's a clash. I've got F natural, I've got F sharp, so it's the same letter name, but with two conflicting accidentals. In this case, one's a natural, one's a sharp, but it's happening simultaneously. So that sounds quite dissonant because of that contradiction. So that's one kind of false relation. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be used. What I am saying is we need to be aware of them. If you were going to try and write a piece of music in the style of, Haydn or Mozart or Bach or Handel or something, it's unlikely you're going to be wanting to write false relations in quite that sort of bold sort of way. But there's another kind of false relation which we might just consider as well. So let me put this chord out there. And let's follow it with this chord. So I'm trying to do one that uses F natural and F sharp again. So this time what's happening is that actually I haven't got a clash within this chord because I've got two F naturals in this chord. In this chord I've got one F sharp as it turns out. So the first chord is a chord of F major and the second chord is a chord of D major. So we don't hear that conflict that we heard in the first chord with the F natural and the F sharp sounding simultaneously. What we do have in this case, though, is another kind of contradiction which comes under the heading of a false relation. And it's this. You can see in this part, in the bass part here, I've got an F natural in the first chord. But in a different part, in the following chord, I've got an F sharp. Okay, now it's one thing to do what I've done in the alto, to start with an F natural that becomes an F sharp. It's a kind of chromatic movement that we often hear between one chord and the next. So that doesn't strike you with any particular difficulty, and it's feasible to do that. The thing that's going to strike us when we hear these two chords together, much more so, is the F natural in one part in a different octave compared with the F sharp in a chord that immediately follows on in a different octave in a different part. So this F sharp there doesn't make too much of an impact, but this F to F sharp makes more of an impact. So have a listen to this. I've got my chord progression. Does it sound wrong? Doesn't sound bad, and it might be fine in certain contexts. And again, this is not to say don't use them, but it is to say be aware of what a false relation is and be careful you've considered its impact so that if you use it, you know why you're doing it. So if we listen to that first chord again, we hear this F natural in the bass and then we hear F sharp up there. So we've got this F natural, F sharp. So you can feel there's the contradiction between the F natural and the F sharp, but you can also hear that because it's between this chord and the next chord, and this is some distance apart, it just somehow slightly grates on the ear, doesn't it? To have those two in close proximity. Now, if you go back to the 16th century, actually you'll find that false relations are used quite a bit by composers, which is interesting because back then they were essentially still writing in modes rather than in major and minor keys, but they'd already started to corrupt the modes a bit by using something we call musica ficta. So musica ficta. And what musica ficta was this notion that, well, you might just insert an accidental. So you might be working through a piece of music in the Dorian mode, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, but you decide to stick a B flat in somewhere that sounds a bit more like D minor to the modern ear, or a C sharp, which would also make it sound a bit more like D minor. Maybe not all the time, but some of the time. So those accidentals that corrupted the modes were this whole area of musica ficta. And when composers started to write musica ficta into their scores, they quite often generated some of these false relations. And it didn't really bother them too much, but as time went by, it became more of an issue. So by the time we get into the Baroque period, composers are much more tuned into this notion of the false relation. And generally speaking, try to avoid the false relation, either as this simultaneous sounding of the contradiction, which in this case is F and F sharp, or the subsequent movement between one chord and the next of, in this case, F, F sharp, going on between different parts at different pitches. So if you want to write harmony that progresses really smoothly and doesn't have that little jar in, well, the false relation is one thing to watch out for. If, having heard some of these and thought about it, you think, hey, I really like the false relation, well, that could be something that could be a feature in your own work. So there we have it, the false relation.